So I made a Facebook post recently that I thought was pretty simple. Turns out it wasn't simple at all. The post said, I'm so confused by the concept of dating. If the purpose of dating is to get married, why are you still dating? And here's what I mean, at least I think. If you're dating to marry, either get married or stop dating. By marriage, I mean a covenant between a man, a woman. No government paperwork needed. That's just my opinion and the way that I feel about it. But my confusion remains. Are you waiting to see if you love this person, or are you willing to make a covenant with the Lord and uphold it no matter what? And honestly, I thought people would either agree or disagree, and that would kind of be the end of it. But instead, the comments opened up this massive conversation about dating, marriage, covenant, trauma, fear, protection, divorce, commitment, and honestly, what love even means. And the more that people responded, the more I realized something. I don't think we were all talking about the same thing. We weren't all using the same definition of what dating means, which means we weren't really even having the same conversation. So this series isn't me trying to teach people how to date. It's more me trying to figure out what exactly modern relationships have become and why so many of them feel undefined. Welcome to the Undefined podcast. My name is Tim, and this is going to be a little bit different than what I originally expected it to be, because this started out as a Facebook post and somehow it turned into what will probably be an ongoing conversation. So before I go much further into any of this, I think it's important for me to be really honest about who I am and where I'm coming from in this conversation, because I don't want this series to come across like, here's Tim's definitive guide to dating and marriage, because that is absolutely not what this is. First of all, I've never been married. I've rarely ever dated in my life, and most of the dating experience that I do have came before I became a Christian. And honestly, since coming to faith, I really haven't pursued dating much at all. So in a lot of ways, this conversation comes from me trying to reconcile what I saw and experienced in the worldly dating culture with what I now believe about covenant, commitment, marriage, and relationships through the lens of my faith. So a lot of my perspective comes from observation, theology, conversations, church culture, modern culture, and honestly, just trying to make sense of what's going on around me in the world of dating. And I think that's partially why this Facebook post even happened. Because when I look at modern relationships, sometimes I genuinely feel confused. I don't feel judgmental necessarily, just confused. Like, what are we actually doing? What are people looking for? What defines commitment today? What does dating even mean anymore? Because it seems like everybody has completely different definitions. And honestly, one of the most helpful things about the comments on that post was realizing that I did not communicate my thoughts very clearly at first. Because when I said dating, people heard wildly different things. Some people heard, you should just marry the first person that you ever go to dinner with, which obviously is not what I meant. Other people heard, you should never take time to discern character or compatibility. And that's also not what I meant. And that realization actually became one of the biggest turning points in the whole conversation for me. Because as the conversation went on, I started realizing maybe we aren't actually arguing about principles as much as we're arguing about definitions. Like, what even is dating? Is dating going to coffee with someone? Is it emotional exclusivity? Is it physical intimacy? Is it spending years together while figuring out if you're compatible? Is it intentional pursuit toward marriage? Is it just companionship? Is it basically marriage, but without the covenant? Because depending on who you ask, you'll get completely different answers. And honestly, I think part of my frustration, or maybe part of my confusion is the better word, comes from how undefined modern relationships can actually feel. Because we've created all these categories now: talking, hanging out, situationships, exclusive but not official, dating but not serious, serious but not ready. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, people are becoming emotionally attached to each other without necessarily sharing the same direction. And I think that's the part that really sticks with me. Not necessarily dating itself, but prolonged emotional attachment without clarity, without direction, without intentionality. Because the more I reflected on my original post, the more I realized my issue may not actually be dating. My issue may be undefined long-term relationships. And I want to be really careful here because I know relationships are complicated. People have trauma, people have fears, people have been hurt, people have been divorced. People are trying to protect themselves. Some people are terrified of commitment. Other people are terrified of choosing the wrong person to commit to. Some people are lonely. Some people are healing. So I'm not trying to flatten all relationships into some oversimplified formula. But I do think this conversation revealed something really interesting. A lot of us want commitment, but we also fear permanence. We want intimacy, but we fear vulnerability. We want clarity, but we avoid defining things because definitions make relationships real. And maybe that's why this conversation resonated with so many people. Because underneath all the arguments about dating and marriage and paperwork and timelines, I think people are really wrestling with trust. Trusting people, trusting commitment, trusting permanence, trusting covenant, and honestly, maybe even trusting themselves. So somewhere in the middle of reading all these comments, I had a realization that honestly changed the way I understood my own post. And it sounds small at first, but I actually think it's really important. I realized I never separated the idea of going on dates from dating. And apparently, a lot of people define those things very differently, which honestly might explain why the conversation got so confusing so quickly. Because when I made the original post, some people interpreted it like I was saying, if you go to coffee with somebody twice, you should immediately get married, which obviously is not what I meant. I'm not against getting to know people. I'm not against intentional conversations. I'm not against spending time together. And I'm not against discernment. And I'm definitely not saying people should rush into covenant with someone they barely know. But I think what I realized, maybe even in real time while I was replying to people, is that my frustration might not actually be with dating itself. It might be with long-term undefined relationships. Or maybe a better way to say it is prolonged emotional attachment without clear direction. Because to me, there's a difference between going on dates with someone intentionally to figure out if there's alignment versus spending years emotionally invested in each other with no real movement toward commitment. And I think that distinction matters because modern relationships can become incredibly blurry. We have all these terms now, like I mentioned before, talking, hanging out, seeing each other, situationships, etc. And honestly, I think a lot of people are emotionally exhausted from trying to navigate relationships that never seem clearly defined. And maybe that's part of why this conversation resonated with people. Because I think deep down, a lot of us are asking, what are we actually doing here? Like, what is the goal? What defines commitment? At what point does discernment become avoidance? At what point does caution become fear? At what point are two people basically building a life together emotionally while avoiding the responsibility of covenant? And look, I know relationships can be complicated. Like I mentioned, I know people have hurt. I know people are carrying trauma. I know that divorce changes how people view commitment. I know that loneliness can make relationships complicated. I know that fear of choosing the wrong person is real. So I'm not trying to reduce relationships down to just get married already. That's not my point. But I do think modern dating culture has normalized ambiguity. And I think a lot of people stay in emotionally committed relationships while avoiding clear conversations about direction because clarity forces vulnerability. Clarity forces honesty. Clarity makes things real. Because once you define something, it costs something. Once you say, this is where I want this relationship to go, now there's accountability. Now there's expectation and risk. And honestly, I think modern culture has become very uncomfortable with risk when it comes to relationships. We want guarantees before commitment. We want certainty before vulnerability. We want permanence without surrender. But covenant has always required faith, not blind faith in a person, but faith that commitment itself actually means something. One of the comments on the post mentioned being equally yoked, and I completely understand that concern. Shared values matter. Character matters. Direction matters. Spiritual alignment matters. But that conversation also made me realize something. I personally don't think you necessarily have to enter a long-term, emotionally attached relationship to begin learning those things about someone. Historically, people learned a lot about each other through community, through church, through friendship, and through family members. through consistency, through reputation, through observing someone's life over time. And maybe that's another tension in modern relationships. Relationships have become increasingly isolated from community. So nowadays, people often try to figure out compatibility almost entirely through private emotional connection instead of communal observation. And honestly, I don't fully know what to do with that yet, but I think that it matters. So maybe we'll talk about that in episode 2. Maybe that's why this series exists in the first place, though, because I don't have everything figured out. But because the more I think about relationships, dating, marriage, commitment, and covenant, the more I realize how many questions modern culture seems completely confused about. And honestly, some of the most meaningful comments weren't even about dating itself. They were about fear or protection or divorce or trauma or healing. And the reality that the way people think about commitment is often shaped by the pain that they've lived through. And honestly, this is where the conversation started becoming way deeper than I expected it to. Because once people started sharing their perspectives, I realized this wasn't really just a conversation about dating anymore. It became a conversation about fear and trust and healing and all those things that I mentioned before. It became about commitment and divorce and protection and clarity. It became about vulnerability and honesty and pain. And I think one of the biggest things the comments revealed is that people's perspectives on relationships are often shaped by what they've lived through, which sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but I don't think I fully understood how much that affects the way people approach commitment. One of the women who commented on the post shared that she had been divorced. And honestly, that shifted the tone of the conversation for me immediately. Because suddenly we weren't talking about ideas in the abstract anymore. Now we were talking about someone who had experienced broken covenant personally. And one of the things she brought up was protection, legal protection, financial protection, practical protection. And I realized pretty quickly that while I was approaching the conversation from a more philosophical or theological perspective, someone else was approaching it from lived pain. And honestly, I think both of those perspectives matter, because when someone has experienced betrayal or abandonment or broken trust, it makes sense that they would think differently about commitment. It makes sense that legal structure feels important. It makes sense that vulnerability feels risky. It makes sense that permanence feels complicated. And I think that realization really challenged me in a healthy way, because it forced me to recognize that not everyone approaches relationships from the same emotional starting. Some people are pursuing commitment. Other people are recovering from broken commitment. And honestly, I think that's one of the reasons modern relationships can feel so complicated, because people are often carrying completely different fears into the same relationship. One person fears commitment. Another person fears abandonment. One person wants freedom. Another person wants security. One person is afraid of being trapped. The other person is afraid of being left. And maybe that's part of why these conversations get so emotionally charged, because underneath the philosophy and theology, there are real experiences shaping the way people hear these ideas. And honestly, I think that's why I want this series to stay thoughtful and careful, because I don't want this to become, here's the right way to date. I think the deeper conversation is, how has modern culture and our personal experiences shaped the way we think about love, commitment, covenant, and vulnerability? And another thing the comments revealed is just how undefined modern relationships have become. Because the more people replied, the more I realized we use the same words to mean completely different things. When I said dating, people imagined completely different scenarios, and some people imagined casually getting coffee. Others imagined emotional exclusivity. Others imagined years-long relationships heading toward marriage. Others imagined basically functioning as a married couple without the covenant. And honestly, no wonder relationships feel confusing. Because if two people enter a relationship using the same words with different definitions, they may not even realize they want different things until they're already emotionally invested. We've created all these categories now, like I mentioned: casual, serious, situationship, courting, dating with intention, dating without labels. And somewhere in the middle of all of that ambiguity, people are trying to figure out what actually counts as commitment. And honestly, I think many people are emotionally exhausted from trying to navigate relationships that never become clearly defined. Because, again, clarity requires vulnerability. Defining a relationship means risking rejection. It means expectations become real and it means that directions matter. And I think another major theme that emerged from the comments was fear of wasting time. That came up over and over again in different ways. And I think most people would agree that discernment is important. But that also raises another question. How long should discernment actually take? At what point does wisely getting to know someone become indefinite hesitation? At what point does discernment stop moving toward clarity? And I'm not pretending there's some magic timeline for relationships. I don't think that there is. But I do think that many modern relationships drift without direction for long periods of time because people are afraid to define what they actually want. And honestly, I think emotional investment complicates that even more because once people become emotionally attached, clarity becomes harder. Now there's history, comfort, routine, fear of loss, fear of hurting someone, and fear of starting over. And suddenly people can spend years emotionally connected while still unsure where the relationship is actually going. And I think that tension leads directly into one of the biggest questions underneath this entire conversation. Have we normalized emotional commitment without covenantal clarity? I think that question sits underneath almost everything we've talked about so far, because modern culture seems incredibly comfortable with emotional intimacy while simultaneously being uncomfortable with permanence. We want connection, but we fear surrender. We want intimacy, but we hesitate at responsibility. We want certainty before commitment, even though commitment has always required some degree of faith. And I'm not saying people should rush blindly into marriage. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think modern culture has created a version of relationships where people can experience many of the emotional benefits of commitment without ever fully defining the relationship itself. And honestly, I don't fully know where all of this lands yet. That's part of why this series exists, because the more conversations I have, the more I realize how layered all of this really is. And maybe that's the biggest thing the comments revealed to me. People aren't just wrestling with dating, they're wrestling with trust. They're wrestling with trusting people, they're wrestling with trusting commitment, they're wrestling with trusting permanence, and maybe even trusting whether covenant still means what it used to mean. Somewhere in the middle of all the conversations, I started realizing something. Maybe this isn't really just a conversation about dating. Maybe it's a conversation about modern culture's relationship with commitment itself. Because the more I thought about it, the more questions started surfacing. Why are people so afraid of permanence? Why do relationship conversations feel so complicated? Why are marriage conversations often considered too serious early on? Why does defining a relationship sometimes feel scarier than being emotionally involved without defining it? And honestly, I don't think those are shallow questions. I think they reveal something deeper happening culturally, because modern culture simultaneously craves intimacy and fears restriction. We want closeness, connection, partnership, emotional safety, consistency, but at the same time, we've become deeply uncomfortable with surrender. We've become uncomfortable with permanence, with obligation, with responsibility that can't easily be undone. And honestly, I understand why. People have watched marriages fail. People have seen betrayal. They've seen abuse. People have seen divorce. They've seen families destroyed. People have watched others lose themselves in unhealthy relationships. So of course people are cautious. And I don't think caution itself is bad. I think wisdom matters, discernment matters, character matters, direction matters. But I also think there's a difference between wisdom and fear disguising itself as wisdom. And that's one of the questions that I can't stop thinking about. At what point does discernment become avoidance? At what point are we genuinely being wise? And at what point are we just afraid? Because I think modern dating culture has created an environment where emotional ambiguity can exist almost indefinitely. Two people can share emotional intimacy, consistency, exclusivity, time, attention, support, even physical intimacy sometimes, and yet still avoid clearly defining where the relationship is actually going. And honestly, I think that ambiguity feels safer to people because undefined relationships create emotional flexibility. If things go wrong, there was never technically a covenant, never technically permanence, never technically full surrender. But at the same time, undefined relationships can also create confusion, anxiety, misaligned expectations, emotional exhaustion. Because clarity may feel risky, but ambiguity has consequences too. And honestly, I think a lot of people today are stuck between two fears: the fear of committing to the wrong person and the fear of never being fully known or fully chosen by anyone. And that's a really vulnerable place to live emotionally. And maybe that's why modern relationships can feel so unstable sometimes, because many people are trying to experience the emotional benefits of commitment while still protecting themselves from the vulnerability commitment requires. Honestly, I don't say that judgmentally. I think most people are doing the best they can with the experiences they've had, because pain changes people. Broken trust changes people. Betrayal changes people. Disappointment changes people. But I also think that modern culture has normalized emotional ambiguity in a way that previous generations probably would have found confusing. We've created relationship categories that intentionally avoid clarity, almost like clarity itself feels dangerous. And maybe part of the reason defining relationships feels so heavy now is because definitions remove escape routes. Once something is defined, expectations exist, responsibility exists. Now your choices affect another person deeply. And honestly, I think that's why marriage conversations often feel too serious to me, because marriage represents permanence, and permanence forces people to confront fear. Fear of failure, fear of being trapped, fear of vulnerability, fear of choosing wrong, fear of being hurt, fear of losing freedom, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough. And honestly, when you really start peeling all this back, I think many relationship conversations are actually conversations about fear. And maybe that's why I keep coming back to covenant, because covenant at its core is not built on perfect certainty. It's built on commitment despite uncertainty. I know that's uncomfortable because modern culture tends to treat commitment like something you should only make once every possible doubt disappears. But I'm not sure human relationships have ever worked that way. At some point, every meaningful relationship requires vulnerability. It requires trust, risk, surrender. Not blind surrender to a flawed person, but willingness to build something that requires sacrifice. And honestly, I think that's part of why these conversations matter so much. Because the more modern relationships become undefined, the harder it becomes to know what people actually mean when they say words like love, commitment, dating, partnership, or even marriage. And I don't say any of this like I have the answers. I really don't. This series exists because I'm actively wrestling with these questions myself. But I do think modern culture has created a tension that's hard to ignore. We want deep connection while simultaneously fearing the permanence that deep connection eventually asks of us. And maybe that's the bigger question. Underneath all of this, have we become so afraid of pain that we've started treating emotional ambiguity like safety? Because I'm honestly not sure ambiguity protects people nearly as much as we think it does. And honestly, I feel like this conversation is just getting started. Because the more comments I read, the more conversations I have, the more I realize how layered all of this actually is. See, what started as a Facebook post about dating somehow opened up conversations about fear, commitment, like I said, vulnerability, trauma, divorce, clarity, covenant, marriage, self-protection, community, modern culture, and honestly, what love even means. And I think part of the reason this conversation keeps expanding is because relationships sit at the center of so many parts of our lives. Our fears show up there. Our insecurities show up there. Our values show up there. Our wounds show up there. Our views of ourselves show up there. Even our theology shows up there. So as this series continues, I want to slow down and really unpack some of these conversations individually instead of trying to force all of them into one single episode. Because honestly, I think some of these topics deserve way more thought than social media usually allows. So one of the future episodes is probably going to focus almost entirely on this question. What does the word dating even mean? Because I genuinely think people are operating with completely different definitions. And if we don't define terms, we may not even realize we're having different conversations. I also want to spend more time talking about the idea of being equally yoked. What does that actually mean practically? How do you discern character? Can you really know someone deeply without dating them long term? What role should community, church, friendship, and just observation play in relationship building? And honestly, I think there also needs to be a much deeper conversation about trauma and self-protection. Because one thing the comments revealed really clearly is that pain changes how people approach commitment. Broken trust changes people. Divorce changes people. Betrayal changes people. And I think it's important to approach those conversations with humility and compassion instead of pretending everyone starts from the same emotional place. And then there's probably the biggest conversation of all: covenant versus contract. What actually makes commitment real? What role should government play in marriage? What does covenant actually mean biblically? What happens when covenant is broken? And why do legal structures feel necessary to some people and uncomfortable to others? And honestly, I don't want those conversations to become argumentative. I want them to become thoughtful because I think modern culture desperately needs healthier conversations around relationships and commitment. I also think we need to talk more honestly about fear of commitment itself because I don't think all hesitation comes from wisdom. Sometimes hesitation comes from fear. Fear of vulnerability, like I said, fear of permanence, fear of pain, fear of choosing the wrong person, fear of losing your freedom, fear of repeating a past mistake. And honestly, I think undefined relationships are often where all those fears collide. Because undefined relationships can feel emotionally safe for a little while, but without full surrender, full permanence, and full, complete vulnerability, eventually ambiguity creates its own kind of pain. And honestly, I think one of the biggest themes underneath this entire series is going to be this tension between clarity and comfort. Because clarity costs something. Defining relationships costs something. Covenant costs something. Vulnerability costs something. And yet at the same time, human beings still deeply long to be fully known and fully chosen. And I think that tension sits underneath modern dating culture more than we realize. So honestly, I don't know how long this series is going to go because the more conversations I have, the more questions I end up with. And maybe that's okay. I don't know. The series isn't really about arriving at perfect answers. It's about slowing down long enough to think deeply about things that modern culture usually rushes past. And if nothing else, I hope that these conversations encourage people to become more intentional, more honest, more thoughtful, more clear, and maybe even more willing to ask difficult questions about relationships instead of just drifting through them. Because I think a lot of people are tired of drifting, tired of ambiguity, tired of undefined expectations, and tired of emotional confusion. And maybe that's why this conversation resonated in the first place. Honestly, I think that modern relationships are carrying way more weight than we often realize. Because underneath all the discussions about dating and timelines and exclusivity and marriage and labels, there are deeper things happening. There's fear, there's longing, there's insecurity, there's hope, there's pain, there's vulnerability, there's trust, and there's the very human desire to be fully known and fully loved. And honestly, I think that's part of why these conversations become so emotional for people. Because relationships touch some of the deepest parts of who we are. Maybe that's why so many people approach commitment so different. Some people are looking for safety. Some people are looking for permanence. Some people are protecting wounds that they've never fully healed from. Some people are afraid of ending up alone. Some people are afraid of losing themselves. Some people are afraid of choosing wrong. And some people are afraid of ever being fully vulnerable with another person. And honestly, I don't think any of that makes people weak. I think it makes people human. But I also think modern culture has created an environment where ambiguity can exist almost forever, where relationships can remain emotionally deep while staying intentionally undefined. Maybe that's why so many people feel emotionally exhausted, because undefined relationships may delay heartbreak, but they can also delay clarity. They can delay direction. They can delay honesty, and they can delay commitment. And I don't think that this conversation is really about whether people should get married faster. I think it's about whether we've become uncomfortable with permanence, because permanence requires surrender. It requires vulnerability. It requires trust. And trust has become difficult for a lot of people. One of the things I've realized through all of this is that people aren't just struggling to find love. Maybe we're struggling to trust permanence. And maybe that's why so many relationships stay undefined. And I don't fully know where all of this lands yet. I'm still processing it myself. That's part of why I'm doing this podcast to begin with. Not because I have everything figured out, but because I think these conversations matter. And I think a lot of people are quietly wrestling with the same questions. What does commitment actually mean? What is dating supposed to be? How much caution is wisdom? How much hesitation is fear? How does covenant look in modern culture? And how do we pursue relationships with both wisdom and vulnerability at the same time? I don't know if there are simple answers to any of those questions, but I do think that they're worth wrestling with. So if you've listened to this far, thank you. Seriously, thank you. And if this conversation resonated with you in some way, I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Not because I'm trying to win arguments, but because I think honest conversations are becoming increasingly rare. And maybe that's part of the problem too. We've learned how to react quickly, but not always how to think deeply. So for now, this is just the beginning. And honestly, I think we still have a lot to talk about.